So let's begin with the priesthood, where he begins in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 7. And keep in mind his audience, what they understand is the Levitical priesthood, what those priests do in the temple. It is the pinnacle rites, the pinnacle ordinances of their religion. They see that as kind of the end-all be-all. And so Paul and others, whoever's involved in writing this epistle, they're making it very clear that there is an inequality. Something is greater than this priesthood and those ordinances that are being performed by even your high priest. And we pick that up in verse 1.
I can imagine how exciting this would be for a Jewish Christian to hear this for the first time. Right? You've grown up in that Jewish religion, you've seen the power and the meaning in the temple rituals, and you understand them. And suddenly you realize, wait, there's more? It's like a great book you've read, and it just keeps on giving. I guess that sounds like the scriptures.
Sounds just like the scriptures. Verse 1, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all. So this king of Salem, or king of peace, that's what Salem or Shalom means, he received tithing from Abraham. So watch what happens. This is an important pedigree. You have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, who has the 12 tribes, and these first sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. So we're going to focus on Levi for a moment. Down the line from Levi, 400 years, you get Aaron and Moses. And then Aaron's posterity, they become priests. Levi's posterity coming down the line, those are the Levites. This is where the priesthood resides, is in that third son of Jacob. Now, with this pedigree on the board, you'll notice Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, who is not a part of this same family. He's not a part of the house of Israel. He's above it, he's separate, he's distinct. And so this epistle is making this very clear in chapter 7 that you're looking at this priesthood as the end-all be-all, the priesthood of Levi, or Levitical priesthood. And so you're seeing how we're setting them up to say, oh, wait, there is something greater than what we currently have.
It reminds me of the book of Abraham and the Pearl of Great Price. When Abraham himself is in Egypt, he's teaching principles of the gospel using the principle of greater than, trying to convince the people there that there is greater than what they even recognize. And he's using the principles of astronomy. He's like, well, you might think the moon is amazing, but there's something greater than that. It's called the sun. But then there's something greater than that. And he talks about Kolob, and then eventually the throne of God. And you get these concepts that there are great things, but eventually there's greater than. And we could even expand the board and say for Melchizedek, there is greater than, all the way until we come to Jesus Christ and the throne of God.
Which some of you are thinking, so why should I care about this? I think one of the takeaway principles, at least for me, one way to look at this is sometimes we get so excited about a certain practice or policy or procedure that sometimes we artificially elevate it or make it bigger than it was intended to be in the bigger scheme of the gospel of Jesus Christ and through the history of time. And that's what's going on here. Look at verse 4 and 5. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the 10th of the spoils. And verily they that are of the sons of Levi, who receive the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they came out of the loins of Abraham. So he's saying, look, the sons of Levi, they're taking tithes from the Jews, from the people, but the great-grandfather paid tithes to Melchizedek. So there's the line of reasoning here. Now you jump down to verse 11. If therefore perfection were by this Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law. That's where the law of Moses was given, under this Levitical priesthood. Why? Because Aaron's brother is named Moses. The law of Moses, it's given, and Moses is of the tribe of Levi. What further need was there that another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? So he's saying, look, there's another priest that's arrived, and by the way, he's not from the tribe of Levi. And it tells us this. Look at verse 14. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning the priesthood. So here's Judah, the younger brother to Levi in these 12 sons of Jacob. Judah's sitting right there, and he tells you there's nothing. Moses spake nothing concerning the priesthood when it came to Judah. In fact, Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood on any of the 11 tribes except for Levi. That's it. So now let's contrast in this inequality or greater than. You could say the Melchizedek priesthood is greater than the Levitical or Aaronic priesthood. Aaron, Levi, Levitical, Aaronic. Why? He gives you the reason why here in verse 20 and 21. Inasmuch as not without an oath he was made priest, for those priests were made without an oath. There is no oath associated with the Aaronic priesthood, but with the Melchizedek priesthood, there is an oath and a covenant. It's a higher priesthood. It's a higher power. It's more access to heaven's capacity, to heaven's authority to do God's work on the earth that has been given to people to accomplish those missions. So that oath and the covenant of the priesthood, if you cross-reference that verse right there, 21, with Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, verse 33 through 40, and look at what the wording in those verses shows about this oath and the covenant that are attached to this higher or greater than priesthood that we're talking about here in this chapter. Which now brings us to verse 22. He says, by so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. Now, the word here, testament, is the exact same word, diatheke, in the Greek, as the word covenant. In fact, diatheke is translated as testament here in verse 22, but in chapter 8, verse 8, 9, 10, you're going to see the word covenant show up multiple times. It's the exact same word in the Greek. The King James translators chose to use testament in chapter 7 and covenant in chapter 8. But it's the same word. It's the same word for the New Testament. It's the new covenant. The Old Covenant, the New Covenant, Old New Testament. It's interchangeable, which now, if you translate that back into the priesthood context, the oath and covenant of the priesthood, it's the oath and the testament of the priesthood. It's all the same word as far as the Greek is concerned.
So Abraham is this key character throughout scriptures. If you go back to Genesis 15, that is where God secures what we might call the Old Testament or the Old Covenant. He secures it with blood. It's a passage that sometimes is confusing, but what happens is God has made promises to Abraham. Okay, this key character here says, there's all these great things I will do for you, Abraham, and to demonstrate that God will obligate myself to you and your posterity to make these blessings available, we're going to cut some animals in half, and I'm going to walk the path, symbolized by a burning torch. So the new covenant, you now have, that was Jehovah in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, he shows up again in flesh, and he allows his body to be the lamb who dies, comes back, and he now secures the updated covenant, which is building upon these promises to Abraham, that the opportunity for salvation is freely offered to everybody who chooses to be in league with Jesus. It's a free gift. And so when we talk about Old Testament and New Covenant, or Old Testament and New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant, that's what we're talking about. And frankly, they're not different. It's just one was for one generation and one, that was the Old Testament. Now, the New Covenant, the New Testament, it is for our generation, our time. And Jesus has secured both. So both Old Testament and New Testament both matter.
So that is a beautiful insight. This messenger of the covenant, this mediator of the covenant being Christ, as you're showing Jehovah in the Old Testament, Jesus Christ in the New or New Covenant. And look at verse 24. But this man, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. You'll notice the Levitical or Aaronic priesthood doesn't have those same promises attached to it, the same unchangeableness attached to it as the higher priesthood does. Wherefore, he, Christ, is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them. Isn't that the essence of what the priesthood is? Is to the person who is functioning in a priesthood office, in a priesthood calling, or with the power of the priesthood in different settings. Is that not the essence of what is happening? They're becoming Christ-like in that they're taking on this role of an intercessor, a mediator. They're serving. They're appealing to God in behalf of an individual or a group of people. They're performing some ordinance. They're blessing, they're lifting, they're healing, they're helping, they're ministering to. It's powerful when you see that priesthood isn't about what can I get from God through priesthood. It's how can I become more like Christ by turning outward after having turned heavenward to say, what would thou have me do? Thy will, not mine, be done. And to then minister to the needs of people around me in an intercessory sort of a way.
And the invitation is for us to strive to be more like Jesus, who is currently greater than, but the promise, the invitation is all of us can be as he is. But until then, we see in verse 26, for such a high priest became us. Okay, so Jesus, formerly Jehovah in the Old Testament, now has become enfleshed like a human, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens. Remember, the book of Hebrews, major theme is greater than. Jesus is greater than all of it. Verse 27, who needeth not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins and then for the people's. For this he did once, when he offered up himself. So the Levitical priesthood had a whole set of rituals about seeking atonement, killing animals, and then the high priest going into the Holy of Holies once a year. And what we're learning here is that Jesus did that once for all of us. There's no need to reenact the high priest bringing blood into the Holy of Holies. Jesus is that high priest. He brought his own blood into the Holy of Holies and thereby invited all of us in.
Which now brings us to chapter 8, verse 1. And remember, again, we've mentioned this many times before, the chapter breaks, those are modern additions. This letter originally was just a letter. So it would go straight from verse 28 in chapter 7 to verse 1 of chapter 8. Look at the opening here of verse 1. Now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. That there are many ways that you can draw people's attention to a summary statement. In the Book of Mormon, for instance, Mormon often will use the phrase, thus we see. It's this draw your attention to a lesson that he's hoping you gain from everything he just got through writing. In this case, this is the sum. Thus we see. Of everything we've been talking about up to this point, don't miss this point right here. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord pitched, not man.
So we're not talking about the tabernacle that existed out in the wilderness that eventually became the built temple in Jerusalem. All good. We're not trying to disparage any of that. Those are all good things, but there's a greater than.
And I love that. I love that comparison to say to the Hebrews in this first century context, you love the high priest and he should be respected and revered. It's not a bad thing. But we have a high priest that is greater than the high priest in Jerusalem. Your high priest has to perform sacrifices to go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, or Day of Atonement. But he's saying, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, this new high priest of the new covenant, of a different order of priesthood that comes with an oath and a covenant, he performed a sacrifice that didn't involve animals. It involved himself, and thus passed into the presence of majesty on high. And remember what happened at the crucifixion of Christ? The veil of the temple was ripped from top to bottom, a heavenly ripping as Christ goes in. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to chapter 10. Now, when you jump down to verse 5, you'll see that there are priests officiating the ordinances of the Levitical or Aaronic priesthood in the temple. And he describes these priests in verse 5. They serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. So everything you see in that temple, the sacrifices, the rituals, the ordinances, the 7 candles of the candelabra, the altar of incense before the veil, the table of showbread, all of those are a pattern, a type, a shadow of heavenly things. They're not the heavenly things. They're just a placeholder for those heavenly things, symbolic.
What's also significant here is the writers of the Epistle of Hebrews are not only speaking to people with a Jewish background, but these are people who've grown up also in a Greco-Roman environment. And there's a particular scientific worldview at that time that's been dominated by the thinking of Plato and Aristotle that assumes that the heavens contain totality and perfection, and that this world is simply a shadow of things that are greater. And so the writers here are both calling upon the memory of the Old Testament and also appealing to people's understanding of how the world is to convince them that that heavenly world that you have heard about is greater than anything you've seen here, and Jesus is the way. He is the one who has shown us how to get out of the shadow world and get into full reality, which is in heaven.
Which, by the way, is the covenant path. That's how we get on this journey from where we are to the real thing. And we pick that up. Look at verse 6 and 7. But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is a mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. So you'll notice in verse 6 it used that word better. This is a better covenant. How is it better? Well, the old covenant, the Old Testament, allowed for one man, the high priest, once a year to go into the presence of God. And everybody else had to be out there with him mediating and taking our prayers and our desires to God. Why is it a better covenant? Because now everybody gets to symbolically come into the presence of God, have table fellowship with him once a week at the sacrament table. And in a more beautiful way, those who are willing to make and keep covenants at a higher level with him, it's not just one man once a year. Anybody who's willing to make and keep those covenants, live those standards that he has outlined for us, they're all invited to come into our modern day equivalent of the ancient tabernacle, first century temple, Holy of Holies, being the celestial room in the temple of our God, everyone who is willing to enter into a covenant with him and keep those commitments is invited to come in, and not just once a year.